I'm Cierra Bettens. Welcome to APTN News InFocus. This episode, a conversation with veteran journalist and outgoing APTN web reporter, Kathleen Martens. 15 years ago, Kathleen walked through the doors of APTN headquarters in Winnipeg to start a new role as a writer and researcher. And despite having 20 years of experience under her belt, working for newspapers, online startups, and national broadcasters, she felt like a newcomer. As a non-Indigenous journalist reporting for an Indigenous news outlet, working at APTN transformed Kathleen's approach to storytelling. She's reported everywhere, from courtrooms to bus jacks, interviewing thousands of sources and winning prestigious awards for her work. As an investigative journalist, she exposed predatory lawyers exploiting residential school survivors and spotlighted the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. In 2023, Kathleen created Our Relatives, a podcast sharing the stories of people experiencing homelessness in Winnipeg. Here's a clip.
Good evening, 190. Check.
190 is the street address for Nadinawimak, Winnipeg's newest and only Indigenous-led homeless shelter. It sits at the bottom of the Disraeli Freeway, next to the city's downtown core. Tonight, we're in a large common room that doubles as the cafeteria.
A sixth bonus episode of Our Relatives comes out this fall. But today, Kathleen joins us to share her journey as a reporter, how the industry has changed over her 35-year career, and what working at APTN has taught her about truth, trust, and storytelling. Thanks so much for joining us, Kathleen.
Thanks for having me, Cierra.
You've been in journalism for 35 years now. Where did it all start for you?
As I look at you, I think that is older than you are. Where it started in rural Manitoba. I worked at a weekly newspaper called the Russell Banner. It was right on the Manitoba-Saskatchewan border in western Manitoba. I had always been interested in journalism, but before that I learned that I really loved to write. Actually, I should say I was always interested in news. And so then I learned there was this wonderful thing called journalism where I could marry my love of writing and my interest in news. And I could work for newspapers. And I learned that very early on. I was always a news junkie. The TV was always on, radio on at home. My dad and I would often debate the news, particularly when there were leadership conventions for political parties and elections. And my dad and I would go to town. So, and I was interested in the world. I've done a lot of traveling. And so, of course, I had dreams of being a foreign correspondent. You know, I'd watch these people on TV and they'd be reporting from all the four corners of the world, and that really interested me. But, you know, I got to Russell, Manitoba. And from there, I went to a daily newspaper nearby, the Brandon Sun. And that was a broadsheet, so that's a different size than a tabloid. And that was very exciting to work there. I lived in the community for 10 years. I reported there on every beat. And then, as you do, you outgrow your community or your job. You've done everything. So then I moved to Winnipeg and I worked at the Winnipeg Sun, which was a tabloid and a very different approach to news. And the stories were much shorter. And so it wasn't unusual to write 5 stories a day. And I covered some of the most interesting beats, particularly the courts, which is still knowledge I use in my job today, all this many years later. And then I went into an online thing. That's when the internet came. And there were these startups. And so a local guy started winnipegfirst.ca, and it was like the Huffington Post before the Huffington Post started. And it was all mobile, all digital, and fascinating, a way to learn how the internet works with our jobs. And I worked there for a time, and then I went to CBC, and I learned they were just starting their internet. So I was doing web stories for them, but I learned radio while I was there, and then television, a little bit of TV. And then I heard about APTN, which I'm almost embarrassed to say I had never heard of. And I had worked in mainstream media in Manitoba for 20 years. And I was completely ignorant. And APTN was just down the street because its headquarters is here in Winnipeg. And they had a researcher-writer job, and that sounded really interesting to me. And after that long in mainstream, I was ready for a change, and they hired me at APTN. And it was culture shock, for one, because there were no Indigenous peoples at any of the other places. I worked with one reporter, her name was T.R. Wilson then, T.R. Wheatley now, and she's here with us again. But I worked with her at CBC Radio in 2010, and she didn't say boo to anyone. She just sat there looking, somewhat frightened, and she was the only Indigenous person in the newsroom. And so when I came to APTN, that reversed those, Then I was like TR, sitting in the newsroom being one of the only non-Indigenous people. And it has been a real wild ride at APTN.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, you started here as a writer-researcher, and in September it'll be 15 years since you started at APTN. Can you kind of take us back to the beginning? What were some of the stories you were working on, and how did it all feel starting here?
Mm-hmm. It felt good. It felt right. I worked in the documentary unit, the APTN Investigate show, and my first story was so incredible. It was about a man from a First Nation in northern Saskatchewan, and he'd been designated a DO, which I didn't know what that was. That's a dangerous offender. And I thought, he must be just a horrible monster, the crimes he's committed, right? Well, he'd committed 2 crimes. None of them had hurt any people. And he was designated a dangerous offender in Saskatchewan, which does that the most in Canada by capita, has the most dangerous offenders. And basically he had 2 strikes against him, and they wanted him DO'd in case he committed a third. And it was a very interesting story to do, because again, I could draw on my knowledge of the justice system, and then with people here at APTN, I learned about that, put me on a path here at APTN about learning about the justice system and Indigenous peoples. And that's still an issue that we all know involves racism and other issues that keep Indigenous peoples behind bars in a disproportionate level. And so all the stories I did early on, I did a story about residential school survivors being ripped off by crooked lawyers. I did a story about Inuit who couldn't afford to buy the food in their local grocery stores and would go to the dump to forage for the food that the store would throw out because it couldn't sell it at its very high prices. And so 3 days we spent in the dump, my camera operator, Josh Grummett, and I, waiting for this truck to come and dump the food from the grocery store. And one of those days was my birthday. And there we are, knee-deep at the dump, and many people come every day. They don't have hardware stores in Nunavut, and so they come and forage at the dump for anything they might need that someone else has thrown away, something for their satellite dish, something for their ATV, something to plug a hole in their window, and they come and they get food. And when the food is dumped, someone puts it on Facebook, and it's just like ants on a hill. Everybody comes and takes what they can. And the store became aware of it and they'd run a knife through a huge bag of flour, and then all the flour would pour out so that someone couldn't take the bag of flour because they didn't want people shopping at the dump, right? So that was a big story, created a lot of buzz in Parliament in Ottawa, and also it started a very unique online group where people in the South, aware now of the food insecurity in the North, started sort of sponsoring Northern families and sending them food. And then when the Northern family would receive the food, the family would take a picture of all the food, beautifully arranged on the floor in the kitchen, and their children around it. It was interesting. It was almost like a Christmas photo, and instead of the tree, there was the groceries, and it went on for a number of years. So those are some of the stories I did, and in doing them, it was all the similar themes that we still report in our stories today, which is systemic racism, structures of injustice, just barriers in general to Indigenous peoples in our colonial society, how we keep them marginalized, keep them on the perimeter, and then punish them in extra ways when they still don't seem to be able to cross the barriers we put up for them. At least that's how I see it. And in the 15 years, we're still reporting on residential schools, for example. We're aware now, Canada's aware now, since the unmarked graves that are suspected to be in Kamloops became national news. Then Canada decided there needed to be a reckoning, a moral reckoning, a greater understanding of Indigenous issues. We've had the reconciliation, the reports. We've had the MMIWG, the National Inquiry. All of these stories come from the same themes, the same foundations that I first reported on 15 years ago. So very interesting that those issues remain, but they may be viewed differently or be treated differently by various governments. So those were some of the early stories I did for the documentary unit. And then when I moved over to the website almost 8 years ago, then I was able to do other stories like the Me Too movement in Indigenous communities, the Wet'suwet'en confrontation with the RCMP and BC. There's just been a number of stories that I've had the opportunity to do, and different within the Indigenous communities meet different types of Indigenous peoples, different bands, different types of government, hereditary versus elected. And it has just been an ongoing education and just an extremely gratifying career at APTN.
Mm-hmm. And so, coming into this role for the first time as a non-Indigenous reporter, how did you navigate, telling Indigenous stories for an Indigenous outlet?
Well, I would say I fumbled around a lot at the beginning because I came in and I used my mainstream approach where we just do a straight story with the facts. We don't change it for anybody. That's the mainstream way. And when I came here, Indigenous peoples pushed back, particularly First Nations people. They didn't want to be treated like that. They wanted to be treated differently. And they said, you also are causing harm in the way you're doing it. And that was my introduction to learning about trauma-informed journalism, which means don't cause further harm in doing your interviews and in gathering your stories. And I'd been told, I was extractive. I was taking stories. I was taking information. I was parachuting into communities. There were a lot of these kind of triggering words that forced me to, in the quiet moments, think about what I was doing. I had done it successfully for 20 years. And suddenly I was being challenged on everything I had done. And it made me a better reporter. It made me a better person to think about how I was doing my job and how to incorporate that into what I do now. And it was a lot of trial and error. But thankfully, these Indigenous peoples are very forgiving, and they educated me. They called me out when I was wrong. And it was like a marriage. We had to compromise a lot because nobody's always happy, right? I still couldn't compromise my journalism, but I tried to do it in a way that didn't cause harm and that also helped tell their stories, because we do stories that nobody else does. And we have access to people no one else has. To me, that is the gift of APTN, that I was able to connect with people in mainstream I would never meet. And that they mostly welcome you into their communities and treat you well and give you access. And I realize that's a big trust, right? We ask a lot. And so now we do our jobs, at least I do, differently, right? I'm more aware of, am I taking? But no, they've invited me. Am I causing harm? No, they want to talk about this painful event in their community. Am I forcing someone to speak to me? No, they want to talk. But I still have to be careful in the questions that I ask. And so I have won awards for that work using that approach. So I do want to tell other journalists it works. You can do it. But it was, you have to want to do it. And I should add too, I had colleagues who also, were protective of their people and would come to me and say, you can't just blast through here like you did at other places. And so I have had some very tough conversations with people at APTN about all sorts of issues, about whether I should even be here. Some of them are very staunchly opposed to non-Indigenous people working at APTN. And some are very protective. They're Indigenous first, and then they're a journalist. And it was a different thing for me because I've only ever worked with people who we never knew anybody's background. We were just journalists. But then, of course, we were all non-Indigenous. So it's interesting, very interesting. And now that I've learned all of this over 15 years, I'm more comfortable with being challenged, with being asked. I can explain myself. I can defend my work. And I feel I've, earned that.
Mm-hmm. And so you've worked at, several different outlets. But I'm wondering, what do you think is unique about the way that we tell stories at APTN?
Well, that they're from an Indigenous perspective. And I'm not an Indigenous person, but I could do my story from that point of view. It's like putting yourself in somebody's shoes, right? Like when I went from the Winnipeg Sun to CBC, it was a different approach. At the Sun, it had its pillars that it covered, right? Sports, entertainment, courts, that and crime. Those were its main drivers of its news. When I got to CBC, it was different. When I came to APTN, it was different. Like every outlet has its own kind of perspective and an audience in mind. Well, we have a different audience at APTN, and we center Indigenous peoples in the news. Like, I'll give you an example. Somebody called me and said, very rich white guy, he wants to give a bunch of money to an inner city school and help, the poor kids there, get a free lunch. And they're mostly Indigenous. And I said, okay, well, you need to call CBC or CTV or the Free Press or the Sun. Well, why wouldn't you do it? Well, we don't write stories about white people helping non-white people or Indigenous people. If we did that story, it would be who we would speak to an Indigenous person at the school, a staffer, a family, and say, how would a free lunch benefit you? And would you want it from someone like this? That's how we would do the story. We would look at the Indigenous part. We would get the Indigenous side of that story. It wouldn't be about lauding the non-Indigenous person. Great, do that. Do your philanthropy. But that's not a story we would do. And I've had to explain that to many people. But that's what makes us unique, because when we go to a news conference, let's say with the wildfires, we're going to ask which First Nations are affected, which Métis communities, what's happening with them, who's fighting the fire there, where are they going, are they being evacuated, where will they come, which city are they going to be staying in? Whereas another mainstream outlet would write the overall story about the fire and all the communities, right? Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Well, we wouldn't. I would lower in the story, say the other communities that are affected, but that's not my top priority. My priority is, are any Indigenous peoples affected or involved in this story? And how so? And is it newsworthy? So that's what makes APTN different. And I know that we get emails from viewers, especially for the TV news, who say, I like watching your news because it's from a different perspective. It gets me thinking of news in a different way. And it also tells stories I don't see on the other outlets. And so that, I think, is why we have the CRTC has recognized APTN as being an important voice in the media landscape, has given us mandatory carriage on the cable offerings, and, you know, supports what we're doing. And that is a voice that Canada also needs.
Mm-hmm. So I want to turn to something that you produced in the later half of your career here at APTN, the Our Relatives podcast. And I know there's going to be a 6th episode that's coming out soon. Can you tell us a bit about what the podcast is about, and what inspired it? You know, your experience telling these stories.
Sure. That's been a bit of a labor of love, that project. It was during the pandemic. It was the first time I'd seen what I call peak homelessness, homeless people living in bus shelters. We have these physical bus shelters here that are like glass on 4 sides with seats inside. It's because of our climate, right? Our winters are cold and very snowy, and the rain, and also the heat. You need a roof over your head when you're waiting for the bus. So they're kind of a 4-season little glass shack, if you will. And you're driving anywhere in Winnipeg, even in the suburbs. And I saw it, you know, mostly First Nations people in these bus shelters. And I was surprised by that. And I realized, yes, because they've had to social distance in the shelters, and they had to reduce the number of beds, and they had to reduce the hours they were open. And so they were left to find their own shelter. And especially in the winter, you can't camp on the riverbank or in a park. So I would talk to my colleagues about this, and I was worried that we were missing this story. And I didn't want to do it in the typical way. I was also worried about TV doing it, because when you take the big TV camera, it's invasive, and, you know, they deserve their privacy. And so we talked about it. I could do it for the web. I could interview them, but then it would be me writing it and then just using their quotes. But we brainstormed the web team. We thought, well, what about a podcast? Because that would be like word pictures, but it would be their own voices. And so I used my skills as a daily news reporter. We took the microphone out. I worked with my colleague, Jesse Andrushko, and he did the recording and I did the interviewing. And just like I would go to any news conference or any event, we did it over in about a month. We went and interviewed people in various places who were unhoused. And that also captured all the sounds around them, the sounds of the city that we can shut out when we go home. But they live with that. And to me, that is one of the most interesting parts of the podcast, is that chaos, that the number of sirens, the dogs barking, the just the cacophony of the city, of all the sounds, even the volunteers who pull wagons downtown with food in the wagons and items to hand out to the homeless. That created a sound of the like the wheels clicking on the sidewalk, and we wanted that. And we met somebody with a cat, and then we could record the cat. And we met someone with a dog, and you know, all those sounds bring a richness and help tell the story in a way that just writing it on the web wouldn't do. And so we are really proud of it and happy with the way it turned out, that even when they wait to cross the street, you know, we have those sensors that kind of ding, 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 ding before the light turns green. All of those sounds are there. And so we even went to a karaoke night at a homeless shelter. And I would have just written that. Oh, at a karaoke night, so-and-so said this. But we take you to the karaoke night. You hear them singing their songs. You hear what song they picked. You hear an elderly man who can barely get out the words because he's coughing so much, but he wanted to perform it. That, I think, brings a humanity that I don't think I've heard elsewhere. You know, it's not in a studio, it's in real time, and it's They're living the life and they're telling us what it's like. And it also tied to a theme I mentioned earlier, which is crime and courts, because as we know, 4 First Nations women were murdered by a serial killer here in Winnipeg in 2022, and he stalked his victims at homeless shelters. And so I wanted to also, in the podcast, I tell that story. It's like a sub-theme. I mention the women, I mention where they were, and through the story, we attended a vigil for them, so you hear the drumming and the singing at the vigil. And so this bonus episode 6 is about the trial that was held last summer, where he was convicted, and the reaction to it, and at the same time, the continuous lobbying for a landfill search to find the women's remains. And you hear the pain, the grief, in their own words, what it's like to go through that. Instead of me just writing it, you hear it. And I think that's A, the beauty of a podcast, and B, shows the kind of access we have at APTN and the level of trust that Indigenous peoples have in us to tell some of these most sensitive yet highly important stories.
Next week, we'll continue the conversation with Kathleen Martens. But in the meantime, you can catch the first 5 episodes of Our Relatives. Find that on aptnnews.ca/ourrelatives or wherever you listen to podcasts. Today's episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Hi, I'm Dennis Ward, one of the hosts of APTN National News. We've expanded our Truth and Politics panel into a weekly podcast. Each episode, panelists Jennifer Leywitz and Negon Sinclair join us to examine key issues affecting Indigenous peoples across Canada. Listen and subscribe on your favorite podcast player.